I'm bored. It's been about a week since I've seen my students because of the incredible snow blanketing the US right now, the incredible cold also. And so what I decided I'd use the time for today is I'd make a video, because that's kind of a hobby for me right now, that hopefully, some of my bored students at home can see, and hopefully it can also help out some other people as well. And what I'd like to do today is have us take a look at one of the more influential books of the last couple years, which is The Anxious Generation by Jonathon Haidt. I am a little late getting on this particular wagon. I feel like Jonathon Haidt, there's all sorts of videos about him online already, and there was already kind of the hype thing. At this point, most of the people have already jumped on the Jonathon Haidt hype train. He's become a very popular person. The book was on the #1 bestseller list, but he is nonetheless a very important person. And to be fair, while this is the first time I'm making a video about him, this is not the first time that I've presented about him. I did a presentation on Jonathon Haidt to the sort of MS Partners conference last year, actually. Jonathon Haidt is a social psychologist from New York University. He is most well known for The Anxious Generation, which came out just last year, focused on the mental crisis in youth. It was on the bestseller list of the New York Times. But Jonathon Haidt has also written a great deal many other books. One that I've been kind of steadily working my way through is called The Righteous Mind. It might be a little hard to see the title, but this is what the book looks like, which is about why good people are divided by politics and religion. So he's a social psychologist. He's very interested in why people think the way they do and why people are so divided. One interesting thing is that Anxious Generation actually started out not being about the mental health crisis. It started out not being about smartphones, which is what it's most known for. What it started out as is an examination of how foreign governments use social media to destabilize American politics. If you're at all familiar with all the controversy, like with Russian bots, people saying online, oh, there's Russian bots engaging with us. That's what he started out looking at, and that was a big problem. But in the course of looking at that, he discovered that there's a much bigger sort of global problem happening everywhere in terms of young people's mental health. And so he decided he'd spend some time on that. So I'd like to spend some time talking about Jonathon Haidt. He also, by the way, wrote a couple other books, which I don't have copies of, but I'll throw them up on the screen. One of them is called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is related in many ways to the information that we see in The Anxious Generation. And he also wrote The Happiness Hypothesis. So he's written quite a number of books. He's quite a prominent speaker at all sorts of different things, and he's really quite relevant for a lot of things today. What he talks about in The Anxious Generation, he links the mental health crisis in youth to social media and trends particularly. This is the part that so a lot of people have latched onto the smartphone side of things, which is good. That is a major part of it. But he also links it to trends in sheltering children, which there's been less attention on. That's something that I feel could be used more, that we could focus on a little bit more, maybe. And so it's a really important book. It's garnered a lot of attention. And I'm just going to kind of go through it chapter by chapter. I'll throw up different graphics and things that I've come up with along the way. First of all, of course, he establishes the point that there is a very clear mental health crisis. Now, a lot of times people like to say, well, that's because of COVID, because everybody was locked up for large portions of time, which is something kind of on my mind right now as we've been spending all this time cooped up with the sub-zero weather out there. But this actually predates the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, there was a very clear mental health crisis going on. He does say it was more noted among women than men, statistically speaking, which could be an error related to how women report this more. But he says it looks like it's a little bit more than that. Like there's more suicides among women than there are among men. There's more signs of women hurting each other. So it's not just a case of men don't speak up about these things. Women are more impacted by the mental health crisis that we're seeing even before the pandemic. And what he says is, this took off sharply in the early 2010s, right around the time that the iPhone was released. Now, of course, anytime you're talking about cause and effect, you have to always establish the principle that correlation is not causation, which is always an important principle. But there have been a lot of other studies related to this. And they've found a number of things. Even Facebook has internal data that supports this. The University of MIT did a study. Kent State did a thing. The UN recently released a thing saying that smartphones and social media have a destabilizing influence on mental stability. So there's a lot backing this up. The question as to why, you have different elements. You have, of course, cyberbullying, which there's been a long-running campaign in high schools trying to put a stab at cyberbullying. I mean, it's one of those problems similar to actual real-life bullying that is going to be always hard to stamp out. But there are other more nuanced elements to it. So smartphones and social media end up with disrupted sleep schedules. A lot of my own students will say, oh, sorry, I was up till 3 a.m. last night. Well, that's bad. I mean, don't do that. It's easy because you lose track of time. You're just scrolling. You're doom scrolling. We literally call it doom scrolling. It's a thing that hurts you. But it's also, it's not just that you're seeing all the depressing news that there is out there, but you are also comparing yourself with images of other people, which oftentimes those images of other people are false. You are, of course, comparing yourself now with a very carefully curated image of a person that they get to sort of show themselves having the perfect life. Especially, like this was true when he wrote the book a couple of years ago, which was really before the large advent of AI, but especially now that you can have AI-generated photos, you can be comparing yourself to things that are entirely not real at all. And it just really enhances the feelings of isolation that a lot of times you get. I'm throwing up a picture here. This is a picture that was kind of brought up on a study of a person who just had a way of putting himself into fake photos. Now, I will note that the pictures are not quite exactly the same, so it's clear some changing has been done between the two pictures. But it's an instance of how somebody could make easily stage a photo that then they could just kind of put themselves into a different environment and say, oh, look at the fancy life I'm having in the Netherlands or wherever. Even before AI, they can easily do that. So overall, correlation sure is not causation, but there is a lot of stuff directly related to show how these things might be connected to each other in a whole lot of ways. One of the things that Jonathon Haidt looks at as going into this also is the decline of what he calls play-based childhood. So he's a social psychologist, and he says what children need in childhood. He says they grow fast, then they grow slow, and then they grow fast again. So they have strong motivations. In free play, they have low-stakes method of experimenting with success and failure. Allowing kids just time to play allows them to experiment what is good, what is bad. It's important that this kind of be synchronous, that they be able to get one-on-one feedback immediately on how it is. It needs to be embodied. It needs to be physical. So having a kid just play with a touch screen that flashes or something is not going to be the same. And it needs to be one-to-one or one-to-several. That means in a group or with one person at a time. Another thing that really benefits children in early childhood is attunement, which means they need to synchronize their movements. They need to synchronize their emotions with others. Being around other people allows them to see, oh, that's not a good thing, what they're doing, or that is a good thing. I don't do that thing. I should probably adapt my behavior more to suit like that. And they can see it in real time and adapt themselves in real time. This is a concept called social learning. You learn by copying and picking the best role models. Now, you might say, of course, but they can do that on social media. That's what social media is all about. The problem is there's two elements of bias that social media really messes with. One is the conformist bias. So you have a problem with attunement that you might synchronize a bit too much. You try to be just like everybody else and blend into the crowd too much. And that gets supercharged by social media. Everybody's sharing, the new background on their profile pic saying, I stand with Ukraine or I'm up against this sort of thing or stuff like that. There's also the competing bias, the prestige bias, the need to stand out, which online gets really skewed because there's too many people online. This is something to me, as somebody who's been posting more videos I've been thinking about, how do I stand out from all the other people posting videos? Maybe I should post more risky, more like edgy content and stuff. And you get a lot of people posting really extreme behavior that way. I used to follow a VR gaming streamer who was posting things about himself just like eating hot sauce and seeing if VR could help with dealing the feelings of pain that he was getting from drinking hot sauce. And then he posted a video being like, why did I do that? That was stupid. YouTube is making me make stupid decisions. I'm going to stop doing that. And so he just stopped. He no longer is on YouTube, which is disappointing for me as somebody who enjoyed his videos, but as far as he goes, is a very sensible decision. The other thing that Jonathon Haidt talks about, the next chapter then, is he talks about the discover mode that children are in and the need for risky play. He says that children have two modes that they go into. There's discover mode and then there's defend mode. And this is the key point of his argument. He says we are overprotecting children in the real world and we are underprotecting them online. Now, the reception to his book has mostly been, oh, so we need to overprotect them online also, which is, okay, we do need to protect them online. That is a portion of his book. But there hasn't been as much feedback on the sort of we're overprotecting the real world. We need to give them a bit more space. Jonathon Haidt has an argument that he calls children being anti-fragile. He uses the metaphor of trees being anti-fragile. Trees are meant to be pushed against, or the wind is meant to push against trees. It helps to compact them in the dirt. Trees need a certain amount of resistance, a certain amount of struggle in order to develop in a healthy way. And he says children are very much the same way. Children need an element of danger. They need an element of stress. There's a narrative, a very strong narrative. You see it in films and TV shows and all sorts of things that like people get phobias because they've been traumatized by an experience in their childhood where like butterflies flew in their space or spiders bit them all over. Statistically, Jonathon Haidt says, that's not what happens. We don't generate phobias based on traumatic experiences. Actually, it's the reverse. If you get a kid that climbs up into a tree, falls out of the tree and hurts himself, that kid will not then be terrified of climbing into trees. As soon as the kid is better again, he will go back up and climb into the tree. What you get phobias of are statistically non-dangerous things, like spiders and snakes, actually. Most spiders, most snakes are not dangerous. Most spiders don't hurt you. Most snakes don't hurt you. They look a bit creepy. There's narratives built up around them. There's stories built up around them. But most of them aren't actually all that deadly, all that painful. We are afraid of things we don't experience. We're afraid of things that are unknowns. And this is a problem in the overprotected world that we're living in because we don't give children the experience, the ability to endanger themselves, which sounds a bit crazy. We don't allow kids to stay in discover mode. We don't allow them to play with an element of physical danger. They play video games, okay, but that's not the same thing. They're on social media. Again, not actual physical danger. Kids do not experience much actual physical danger. Thus, they do not have the ability to sort of develop sort of a mental readiness for it. This is a trend that started in the 1980s and 90s, and it's really only gotten worse ever since. Most playgrounds you go to now, you couldn't hurt yourself on those things if you tried. Which, obviously, we don't want hurt children, but a certain amount of physical danger is helpful for teaching kids, oh, this will hurt me if I do this. This won't. I now know what it is. Also, I know what being hurt feels like, and I'm no longer terrified of it. And we've taken away that experience, so now kids are terrified of everything. A good example that he oftentimes says that he does when he's talking is he says he asks people, at what age were you granted freedom? And he goes through this whole process, and he looks at like people from the boomer generation oftentimes could like walk for miles and were able to do that at a very young age, like 6 or 8. And then as like the generations get younger and younger, it gets more and more like it was 10 or 12 before they could just wander wherever, or 14 or 16. And you get to like people today who are like in their 20s and still don't feel their parents don't feel comfortable letting them out of the house. There's a real suffocation almost of development going on. This is a particular problem, he says, because especially in modern society, particularly say in America, there is a blocked transition to adulthood. There is not a clear line between this is a child and this is an adult. We used to have sort of like rituals. We used to have, say, quinceanera festivals, or we have Yom Kippur, not Yom Kippur. There's all sorts of different things where like people, there are festivals around the world that show like when a person moves from puberty to adulthood. And in modern society, we've kind of done away with those sort of growing up rituals. And so there's not a clear line as you were a child, now you're an adult, you're meant to sort of face up to things. There's a problem because children have high potential, but low ability. They can develop in almost any direction. And as they develop in those certain directions, they become specialized via pruning and myelination. The myelination is the coating of neurons with fatty material that makes those neurons particularly specialized in one direction so that their brain works a lot more quickly in one direction than another. That causes them, of course, to lose potential in all areas, but it helps them to develop ability. Unfortunately, with safetyism, keeping them from having like real life experiences, that blocks their experience and that blocks them from developing the necessary pathways to develop that potential, to develop that ability. Smartphones, of course, also means that they aren't having these real life experiences because they're spending all the time on their phones. And it also, the advent of smartphones means that they reduce their interest in non-screen based experience. There's a constant problem I'm having with my students. I need them to put down the smartphones and just focus on the real life experiences. And they do not wish to because their phones are full of games that are specifically engineered to distract them. Online, it doesn't matter how old you are. We were just talking about how society had these sort of milestones where like you are now of an age and you can like sort of be considered a person. That doesn't really happen online. The closest thing they have to like, are you 18 or older? Which people just click yes and move on. So there's no milestones. There's no real guidelines. Again, there's no protection online. So at this point, Jonathon Haidt moves into his main thesis, the part that most people focused on, which is the Great Rewiring, the rise of the phone-based childhood. And people have just really focused on this element. He says there are 4 foundational harms that smartphones and social media have done to children. One is the social deprivation in terms of face-to-face. People don't actually just literally hang out. This has caused problems like the male loneliness epidemic. This has caused all sorts of issues just with people talking to each other face to face. They don't do it anymore, especially if you're not part of a club or if you don't go to church. Even at school, students will sit right next to each other and not talk face to face. They'll be at a lunchroom just glued to their phones, not interacting with each other. Sleep deprivation, of course, we talked about before. Attention fragmentation. This was something people were familiar with even before Jonathon Haidt outlined it. Nicholas Carr did an essay, back in the 1990s, I want to say, called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And he picked up on the idea that with the internet's ability to like immediately gratify things and the ability to quickly switch from one tab to another, it was ruining our attention spans. It was making it so that it was very hard for us to focus on long-form texts, long-form books, to think about things in a long way. It's overall, social media too does, the 4th problem that social media causes is addiction. It's designed to be addicting. Any product really is designed to be addicting, but social media is an addictive product that has a direct line to your pocket. It's like if you could reach into your pocket and pull cocaine out at any moment. That's more or less what it is. So it's a very hard addiction to shake. I don't want to come across as a Luddite here. I don't want to come across as somebody who's anti-technology. Most of you are probably watching this video on your phones. There's a lot of benefits. There's all sorts of ways you can connect with the community. Heck, I'm using this right now to connect with people who I can't see because of how freezing cold it is outside. If you're reading Laura Ingalls Wilder, The Long Winter, that would have been a lot more people would have been able to deal with things a lot more conveniently if they'd been able to like just watch and communicate things back and forth. But there's a lot of strong harms that smartphones are creating in our society, and we need to be smart about how we use them. I was trying to think of a different word there because I didn't want to reuse the word, but never mind. I think of this, incidentally, a lot because of all the stuff with AI. Constantly what I'm being told is, well, AI is just the way of the future. You know, we can't fight it. It's just going to be a thing. And this is what people said about smartphones for a while. They were like, well, smartphones are just the way of the future. You know, we got to be with them. We got to use them. And I was kind of on that. I was kind of part of that group when I was an early educator. I was like, okay, let's try to use smartphones in class. Let's try to find a way to engage the technology in class. And it's turning out that there's a lot of drawbacks to that. And so just because a technology is new doesn't mean that we should embrace it wholeheartedly and not like have any safeguards in place. Oftentimes it's the reverse. So let's talk about the gendered aspect of this. One of the things that Jonathon Haidt does bring up is that social media hurts girls more than it hurts boys. This is one of these uncomfortable points, perhaps. He's very careful about how he phrases this, but I've actually gotten surprisingly little pushback on this part of my presentation. First of all, girls use social media more than boys, so they are more prone to the harm that is inflicted. The reason for this, Jonathon Haidt says, and this is kind of really something of a revelation to me. I hadn't heard this before. He says this on page 152. Girls and boys are similar psychologically in most ways. He says, for a basic overview of psychology, they're basically indistinguishable. But, he says, there are a few gender differences that show up widely across cultures and eras. Researchers have long found that girls and women are more focused on communion strivings, which researchers may have long found this, but I had not heard that before. This is a bit of a thing. Girls are more interested in connection. Women are more interested in communing with each other, forming friendships, forming relationships. One of the things he'll say later, that boys are more interested in what he calls agency strivings. Boys tend to strive more to be independent, powerful, respected on their own. Girls want to connect with other people. And this means then that social media has a bigger impact on them. They are more impacted by visual social comparison and perfectionism. This is partly a cultural thing. We tell girls that, we're constantly complimenting girls on, oh, you look so pretty. There's all these cultural messages that girls need to look pretty and they need to be perfect and all these other things. And so when girls use social media, they are oftentimes flipping through images, comparing themselves to photoshopped images, which are touched up in all sorts of ways. Girls' aggression also tends to be more relational. When guys fight, they punch each other. When girls fight, they tend to socially destroy each other's lives. They will attack each other's friends. They will try and destroy each other's social reputation. As a teacher, I have also seen girls get into like physical throwdown fights, and they can be very mean when that happens. But that tends to be like sort of the end of a long progression of like social assassination, which tends to be what they start out with. One other thing, which is pretty well known, girls more easily share emotions and more things about their disorders, emotions, things like that. They tend to express themselves more. Again, they're striving for communion. They're striving for connection. By the way, this connects really nicely to another article by Deborah S. Tannen, which is called Sex, Lies, and Conversation. She talks about the differences between men and women. She notes that women stare directly into each other's eyes. Men stare far away when they're talking to each other. They don't want to be focused on each other. That's just kind of an aside there. So this is a common thing people say. Men don't talk about their feelings. Girls do, and that can be very helpful in dealing with mental health. But unfortunately, it can also have the impact that if one girl is feeling sad, then all her friends likewise will begin to feel sad, sort of in empathy with her. And so the mental health problems that social media embodies spread very quickly among a group of girls. If the comparisons on social media are causing one girl to really start to doubt herself, she can easily spread those feelings to the other girls in her support circle, which is unfortunate. And finally, something else, of course, that we know, girls are more subject to predation and harassment, both in real life and online. And so social media has a negative impact on girls much more strongly, and that's why the mental health crisis is so much more pronounced in women than it is men. Now, that being said, Jonathon Haidt does not say that men are like totally unproblematic and there's no problems going on with men in this thing. He has a whole chapter in his book about the specific problems that boys are facing. One, he says boys have a strong perception that they have no chance of success. They see that a lot of sort of male-coded jobs are no longer economically valuable for them. They also, just in terms of development, they don't get a chance to experience a lot of sort of foundational things that culture tells them are really important for boys. Safetyism is more negative to developing boys. And so what this winds up on is a lot of boys kind of get wrapped up in video games and pornography. They become hermits who retreat into the virtual world in a lot of ways. Now, again, I don't want to come off as a Luddite. I love video games myself. I have a whole bunch of videos on the benefits of video games. However, they become negative when they become a replacement for long-term friendships, long-term connections, long-term real interactions. And again, they're designed to be addictive. They're also a big opportunity cost. Anybody who's spending a lot of time on video games, this is something a bit convicting for me, aren't getting a lot of other things done that could potentially develop themselves more. Most problematically, though, the whole disconnect with pornography and video games, it disconnects young men from a community with the moral authority to restrain their desires. If men and boys become isolated in rooms just kind of by themselves where they're playing video games all the time, looking up porn all the time, then they have no sort of authority surrounding them saying, no, you shouldn't think that way. You shouldn't act that way. And that can be a real problem. Because that's a major guardrail against suicide. There's been a lot of talk about the male suicide rate, and part of that has to do with the male loneliness epidemic, and part of it also has to do with the fact that men don't have a lot of moral authority figures surrounding them. So, what then is a way to deal with this? Or rather, another sort of way that social media has cut into one of the major guardrails against depression, against mental health. Spiritual elevation is a major way to kind of rise up against depression. I have another book. I don't want to run and grab it right now. It's called The Awakened Brain, which talks about the importance of religious faith and spiritual thinking in terms of dealing with depression. This is not about that. This is Haidt's book. Haidt's an atheist. Nonetheless, Haidt thinks that there is room for the spiritual in life. And he considers that the fact that society has lost a sense of the virtual, selfless actions that bring one closer to a sense of the divine have been a net loss for society that's also contributed to this mental health crisis. He says spiritual practice, consciously or unconsciously, has a lot of sort of practices baked into it that help with mental health. So, for instance, shared sacredness. These are practices identified David DeStano that have psychological benefits that most religious groups do at some point. There's shared sacredness. This means you are part of a group. This means you are surrounded by moral authorities like what restrains sort of desires. There is also embodiment in a lot of religious rituals. You have eating and drinking together. You might think, of course, of like Mass, Ramadan, things like that, but also even just like a church potluck. Eating and drinking together is a great experience. Stillness, silence. We have like meditation, we have prayer, we have all sorts of things where you are just required to sit still for a bit. This isn't a part of modern society. Smartphones do not encourage you to sit still and just think for a bit. They encourage you to always be thinking, always be distracted by something, and we've lost that. Religious practices, of course, are about transcending the self. That's another point. When you transcend the self, you are forgetting yourself. You are trying to connect with something larger. And that helps with a lot of sort of these depressive thoughts. Being slow to anger, quick to forgive, is important in a lot of religious traditions and can really help in terms of emotional purging. And finally, most religious traditions have some aspect where they find awe in nature. You could probably connect that to transcending the self, finding something larger outside yourself. But the bigger point is, you have these 6 points, and phones and social media cut into all of them. All of them to some degree. If you're with phones and social media, you're not really part of a group. You're not in an embodied space eating and drinking together. You are not being still. You are not focused. You are not transcending the self. You are not forgetting yourself to focus on something larger. You are not being slow to anger. Online culture, in many cases, is about rage baiting and giving immediate angry responses to things. You're certainly not finding awe in nature. The best that can be said is finding beautiful pictures of nature online, which is not quite the same thing. So, phones have cut into a lot of the ways that we relax, a lot of the ways that we find spiritual awareness, and that we sort of repair our mental health. So, Haidt is not just a guy who writes a book complaining about all the problems of the world. He has specific things that he's looking into in terms of how do we take collective action for a healthier childhood and a healthier world. So he looks at governments and tech companies. He thinks that the government should assert a duty of care for tech companies, that companies have a moral or a legal responsibility to care for their customers. Their customers aren't much good to them if they're dead or crazy, particularly for their treatment of minors. He thinks also the government should establish an internet adulthood, or an age at which one can open an online account. He says 16 would be a good age to set. It is currently set at 13 due to COPPA. They were talking about this, I believe, in Australia recently. He thinks, of course, anybody can fake their age, so he believes that there should be age verification of some way using, say, networks, a network identification system, blockchain tokens he talks about, even biometrics, which is a thing that perhaps people afraid of a surveillance state might be leery of, but he feels it would be an overall benefit. Governments should encourage phone-free schools. That we're absolutely doing all across the nation. There's all sorts of states that have already adopted things. It was just passed in Michigan. There is a bill blocking phones in schools. Again, we've really gotten on this idea of, we're not protecting kids online enough. He also says we should encourage play in schools. Again, the part of his book that's kind of gotten ignored is the part that we should encourage kids to take more risks, and we should allow kids more free play. He says we should encourage play in school. I haven't seen as much about that, so maybe that. He says we should design public space with children in mind. Things like libraries that have children play places, things like that. He also believes vocational ed and apprenticeships would be particularly helpful for boys who are often, again, finding themselves left behind in the modern world. In terms of what schools can do, he says phone-free schools, again, of course, but playful schools is the other thing that he focuses on. That means longer recess times. I've heard less discussion about that. That means opening the playground before school so that kids can play on the playground and have time to play and experience danger there. Even say offering a play club with free play after school. My school does have something like this. But I believe it's more used as just kind of a way to give parents more time to pick up their kids. And it's not really about just giving kids the time to play. But for whichever reason we put it in there, it's still a helpful thing to have. He has a project called the Let Grow Project, which encourages kids to take more risks and push themselves into new things. That's something I've used in my own class to varying degrees of effectiveness. He also says playgrounds and recess should have fewer rules just in general. Allow kids to regulate themselves. This is a difficult proposition for schools to follow because schools, of course, are liable to lawsuits, very much do not want bad press where things could go badly. But Haidt feels very strongly that that's the best way to encourage kids to regulate themselves and develop the necessary emotional readiness to help with the mental health crisis. What parents can do. Practice letting kids out of sight. Just because your kid is out of sight does not mean they're going to die or get kidnapped. They're finding now, there was this whole wave in the 1980s and the 1990s of like stranger danger. This belief that like people would see a random kid walking on the street and just grab them up there, which occasionally happens. But they're finding now that most kidnapping cases are done by people who know the child, sometimes even a family member. So stranger danger, then they're sort of going to reformat their thing on that. So just practice letting kids out of sight. If there's sleepovers or there's events like that, don't micromanage them. Let the kids have their fun on their own. Encourage kids to walk to school in a group. Let kids just kind of play after school. Take them camping. Go camping or send them off camping just to like be in a tent in the outdoors. Allow them time on their own. He suggests to limit screen time to 2 hours a day, but focus more on maximizing in-person activities and on sleep, just making sure that they're getting healthy sleep schedules. Provide structure. Use parental controls. Use filters on all devices. This is something that my brother and my sisters have all been really good about with their kids, using filters on the devices that their kids have. Look to see if there's signs of addiction. If you really feel it's important for your kid to have a phone, you can give them like one of those basic flip phones, but smartphones should be reserved for, he again suggests, age 16. So that is the course of Jonathon Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. It's had a lot of strength online. It's been very popular. There's been a lot of attention directed to it. Again, I feel like most people have focused more on the smartphones are bad side of it than on the kids need more freedom and more dangerous play. So while I'm very much anti-smartphones in schools, I also feel that it's important that we give kids more experiences. So I'd like to see more attention brought to that. But I have spare time, so I thought I'd get the word out there. This is an excellent book. I very much recommend that you read the full book yourself if you are at all interested in this topic. I also just recommend it as a course of action for anybody who's interested in child development. So